Well, hey, my name is Ben, and I have the honor of serving as a lead pastor here at Downtown Community Church. And I want to say, man, we're just glad that everybody's here this morning. There's so many other places that you could be, and you decided to spend it with us, and that's not lost on us at all. I want to introduce today's kind of talk and topic through a bit of an abnormal way. If we haven't had enough time to experience or be introduced, then you might not know this about me, or if you're relatively new to our church, you might know this about me. But I actually don't just do church for a living. My primary job and my primary paycheck, or really my paycheck, the best way to say it, comes from our family meat company. I run our company called Register Sausage. Sell smoked pork sausage to approximately 1,000 grocery stores kind of across the Southeast. Just recently launched in Publix, so go, buy, shop, be blessed. Yeah, that's cool. Thanks. The reason I bring that up is because one of the things that I did a while ago is I knew that with my position as the lead pastor and the CEO, lead pastor of the church, CEO of the company, not lead pastor and CEO of the church, that's, not a great church model. I knew that if I don't continue to grow as a leader, then I become the limiting factor of our organization, right? If I don't continue to push myself, if I don't continue to grow, and as many of you know, pushing yourself to grow can be difficult because we deprioritize it when things get busy, and so I needed to put some structure around it. So I decided I'm going to go back and I'm going to get my master's in management. And so I've been kind of taking for the last couple of years one course, one class at a time through some, digital kind of platform. Well, the school is kind of irrelevant. It's, it's like TCC of the North, we'll say. And it's this incredible opportunity to learn from great people. And so this week I started class. Like many of you did a couple weeks ago, I started class and it was an online thing. I'm learning from this dude that's a brilliant management consultant, management company, business, corporate strategy. And the class is management consulting. Management consulting. It's all about business. It's all about strategy, frameworks, all kinds of different things, which if you know me, that stuff's like catnip for me. There's something about that I'm just like, ooh, this is fascinating. So as we're in class, a lot of the course is based off of case studies, right? So you study one particular case, one particular business, one particular company, and as you're studying that one particular place, company, business, there's questions that arise. There's what would you do, and you kind of compare and contrast with what they did and how it worked. And so what's interesting is in the class, it's day one, and the professor's talking. He asks a question and gives room for everybody to answer. And there's about 20 people in this class, so you've got opportunity to talk. And you know how it is where he presents this case study and says, okay, I want you to go into breakout rooms, and I want you to talk about what you would propose to the CEO if you were a consultant. Now, does anybody have any questions? And you know this, if you've ever been in any type of a class that you meet digitally, is all of a sudden like 5 hands go up, and no one has a question. Everyone has a statement to prove how smart they are. Anybody ever been in that class? Okay, some of you have, some of you haven't. If you haven't, that means you're the person in that class and you're just not self-aware of that, right? Like we all have that, and it's like, dude, okay, we get it, you're smart, okay, that's a 3-syllable word, you could have used 1, Every time you use therefore, it doesn't sound cool. Sometimes it just make you sound like you're from Perry, therefore, type of thing, like it's not that cool. Anyway, so we get into this conversation, and I'm kind of, paying attention to what's going on, and so I'm thinking, gosh, am I wrong here? I have so many questions. I have so many questions about what I would do, what I propose. There's such limited information, so I raise my hand. And the classic thing is, right before he calls on you, he pauses. He says, okay, now I just want to pause and say, I don't know what you guys are about to say, but I want to open up the room for more questions. And that's kind of like when you're about to go clean the kitchen, and your spouse says, hey, will you go clean the kitchen? It's like, bro, it makes it so much less valuable, the fact that you just told me to do it when I was on my way to do it in the first place, right? And so I paused and I said, well, here are kind of my questions and whatnot. And the weirdest thing happened is he kind of he lightly addressed, I asked 3 questions pretty quickly. He lightly addressed the first one and didn't even touch the second 2. And I'm like, something inside of me, and you know this, something inside of your class, like when you kind of drilled this thing. But it just doesn't gain traction. And then there's other people, and they're saying stuff, and it's kind of, and it kind of just kind of skips along and continues on. And we finished kind of the rest of the class, and it was interesting because the entire time I'm thinking, did I mishear that? Did I misunderstand that? Was there something that I was off on? Was there something that I didn't understand? Because I'm actually doing somewhat of an evaluation of if I can trust this professor as a professor, if I can trust him as a teacher. Because one of the things that I refuse to do is to sign up for a class I don't plan on learning from. To me, that's stupid. And so, at the end of the class, he's wrapping it up, and he says this. He says, now, if you'll notice earlier when I presented the case study, I didn't cling to anybody's idea. I didn't cling to anybody's thoughts. In fact, I didn't really embrace or show favoritism towards anyone's answer. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I just kind of acknowledged and moved on to the next thing. And let me tell you why I did that. So I'm like leaning, I'm like, okay, you did it because you knew that I was right and everybody else was wrong. You used to want to make everybody feel bad. Oh, that's so kind of you. Now, he says, I did that because what I want you to learn is to advocate for your ideas. What I want you to learn is I want you to learn that in the consulting field, at times, you're going to be dealing with executives who know and who think, and you have to learn to properly and appropriately and with tact advocate for your ideas. And so I didn't show anything or gravitate towards anybody because I want you to begin to learn that. Now, for me, as a student, I knew he was a teacher. But this awareness of what he was doing when I didn't know that he was doing something, this awareness that I didn't know he was being intentional when I was unaware of the intention, when he gave me the realization of that, I knew he was a teacher the whole time, but for the first time, or maybe not just for the first time, but more than before, I actually realized I can trust this teacher to teach because he's thoughtful and intentional and aware. And the reason I lead with that is today is not really about us. Today is not really about here's what we do, and here's what we learn, and here's what we take, and here's what we run with, and here's how we apply this, and here's how we live for Jesus like we never have before. Today is just simply kind of I want to pull back a little bit and show us this thing about faith, show us this thing that happens in Genesis that just brings us to an awareness that my hope is that we realize we have an incredibly intentional teacher in whom we can trust, and that if there's nothing else that shifts, it just shifts our mindset a little bit to say, I can trust this God. Now, if you haven't been with us, let me catch you up a little bit. We're on this semester-long journey called By Faith. By Faith Challenge we launched, and in essence, it's started out of Hebrews, where the writer of Hebrews is writing to this church that's being persecuted. It's writing to a church that's being pushed down and that's about to give up their faith because living for Jesus in their context was incredibly divisive. In fact, not just divisive, it was persecuted. And so what they knew is, man, if I'm going to continue in my faith, I need to be encouraged in my faith. And so the writer would say, okay, so here's what faith is. It's acting in the certainty of God and the uncertainty of this world. Acting with certainty that I trust God and the uncertainty of this world. And then goes and says, now here's a bunch of people to describe or to give examples around faith. And so for the semester, what we did is we launched this it's kind of a reading guide. It's a mixture of an app or a Devo, but it's really just kind of our central guide of which it will guide us through the rest of the semester. If you haven't downloaded, you can go to DCC Tally on the App Store. You can download our app, and I do not care if you download our app. You can delete it once we're done with this whole thing if you would like. But here's the point of it, is every week when we come in together, what we're going to do is we're going to be studying some of the people that we read the previous week. And just kind of pulling out, here's some interesting things from text. Here's how our faith is encouraged and driven by this. And if you've been reading this week, you know that we've been in the book of Genesis studying Abraham. Or for most of it, his title was Abram. Now, almost every one of us have heard of Abraham. And if you haven't heard of Abraham, you've probably at least heard of a song that includes Abraham. Because Father Abraham had many, and many sons had. And I am, and so are. So let's all... Right. Yeah. You got it. Very, very good. Sunday school. So God makes this promise to Abraham, but at the time his name is Abram. If you got your Bible, and I'm just going to read this really quickly. This is kind of when God begins to zone in on Abram specifically. In Genesis chapter 12, I don't know if this is going to be on the screen, so I just want to read some context. This is God's promise. He says, okay, Abram, this is a promise for you and for your wife, Sarai at the time. And I want you to know that I'm going to do something with you, in you, and through you. Genesis chapter 12, verse 2. He says, I will make you a great nation. Oh, there's some light. That's good. I was starting to feel a little bit like, man, it's kind of dull. All right. I'll make you a great nation. I'll bless you. I'll make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will dishonor you, and who dishonors you, I will curse. and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he had departed from Haran. Now, so God makes this promise. Abram, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to give you a land. I'm going to give you a people. And through your people and through your land, you're going to bless the entire world. Well, the problem was Abram, who would later be renamed Abraham, which, is, kind of later on in the chapters and in the days of reading. Before he renames him, he says, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to make a promise, and then you're going to have a family. I'm going to make a promise, and you're going to have a land. I'm going to make a promise, and you're going to be a blessing. And these are kind of the cornerstones of the promise of God to Abram. But the problem is number one, Abram didn't really own land. And number two, he had no family. He had no heirs. He had a wife, and that was it. And they were barren, 75 years old. And God shows up and says, hey, congrats. You're going to get pregnant. Now, I don't know if there's any 75-year-olds in the room. Just want you to imagine how that would happen with you and your, spouse. You're walking around and it's like, hey, guess what? God told us to move and that we're going to have a toddler. It's like, bro, I have zero energy for either of those things. Yet, he trusted God. He went. And what's fascinating, too, before we get to kind of the main text for today in chapter 15, what's fascinating is if you've read this, here's what you've read. That the Bible does not paint. In Hebrews 11, oftentimes it has this big title at the top of it that says, like heroes of faith or the hall of faith. And let me tell you one of the things that I love about the Bible is that the heroes of faith or the hall of faith, if you have read through the Genesis accounts that we've laid out in week 2, then what you'll read is that this dude massively had steps of faith and had incredible and extraordinary failures of faith too. Here's why I say that. If you ever read an account of someone in history who only does things good, that's not a trustworthy account. Some of you read the Bible or you read this Genesis and you're like, hold on. He's a hero of faith, but at some point he went to the king who's in Egypt and he lied and said his wife was his sister so the king could take his wife so he wouldn't be killed. Is that what God called him to do? Well, no. Well, is he a hero? Yes. Well, what about that time when he wasn't sure that God was actually going to fulfill this promise? Because the problem is God said, you're going to be a nation. You're going to have a family. And he has no heir. He has no children. And his wife says, well, take your servant. Sleep with her. Maybe that's how God's going to fulfill the promise. And he did. Is that obedient? No. Here's why I say that. If we can just pause and embrace that, here's what we realize. There's humanity. There's humanity in these people. Every hero of faith, and I just want to say this from the outset, every hero of faith that we study, they did not have perfect faith, they had resilient faith. Which means that they did not execute obedience with perfection, but they executed obedience with continued effort, oftentimes resulting in obedience, though sometimes not, but they didn't let the times of not dissuade them from the times of obedience. And so one day, God comes to Abram. He says, Abram, let me tell you again about what I'm going to do. And if you got your Bible, you can go to Genesis chapter 15. So after these things, there's some stuff that went down, and Abram rescues his dude Lot. Has this conversation with Melchizedek, which is later New Testament stuff. Verse 1, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. This is what God said, fear not, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, oh, Lord God, what will you give me, for I continue childless? Now, this is years after. He was 75 when it started. This is years down the road. And the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. And the Lord's just saying, okay, God, like I believed you. I believed you. I believe that you said that this promise was going to come true. I believe that you said that this was going to happen. I believe that that's going to happen, God. But I'm looking around, and it looks like the context around me looks nothing like what you promised me. Now, what's interesting about this is, I think, if there's a place where we really enter into the story, it's here. It's God, you promised, but I'm not seeing it. God, I was obedient, But it just doesn't seem like it makes sense right now. It doesn't seem like it makes sense in this context. And God, I've been praying for this person who I know, who's in my class. I've been praying for this person who's in my fraternity sorority. I've been praying for this for my kid. I've been praying for my parents. I've been praying for my spouse. I've been praying for this parent that we met in the pickup line. And God, I've just been praying, but it doesn't seem like anything is happening. So Abram said, God, you're not giving me any offspring. I don't have anything to go on here. What do you want me to do? And behold, the word of the Lord came to him. This man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir. And he brought him outside and said, look towards heaven and number the stars, if you're able to number them. The answer was no, he wasn't able to number them, by the way. Then he said, and this was the point, so shall your offspring be. And this verse in verse 6 is massive. And he believed the Lord. And he believed the Lord. This is what Paul is going to later on jump into and say, hey, before the law, before the rules, before the regulations, before the morality of religion was really set in place, there was a righteousness, a right standing with God that was accomplished outside of behavior and morality and behavior modification. There was a sense of I could be right with God that stood apart from what I did. In fact, it always has. And what did he say? And he believed the Lord. In other words, he had faith. And he, God, counted it to him, Abraham, as righteousness. And there's one thing I want to point out. Notice what it doesn't say. And he believed in the Lord. That's a really important point. I never doubted that my professor is a professor. My school said that. But when I experienced the thoughtfulness, I realized this is someone in whom I can trust with the educational trajectory in this subject area. Many of us, we believe in God like we believe our teachers are teachers, or like believe our bosses are bosses, but many of us have people, have leaders in our life that are over us, org chart, that are over us, in whatever place or context. And the truth is we believe they're a leader, we just don't believe they're a leader worth trusting in. And it says, okay, so this is what he did. He realized, I don't just believe in God, but I'm actually trusting God. I'm actually saying, okay, God, I'm believing you for this. Like, not just a conceptual, I agree that you exist existentially, but in your existential existence, what I'm actually saying is, no. I'm going to do what you say because I believe you are who you are. And if you are God, then I'm going to trust you know everything. So he believed the Lord. And he said to him, God said to Abram, I'm the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. And look what he says back. But he said, and this is fascinating because he just believed God. But then he also asked God, and it says, but he said, oh Lord, how am I to know that I shall possess it? Now this is fascinating. So he says, okay, God, I believe you. I believe you. I believe that what you said is real. I believe that what you said is true. And I believe that I'm going to take this step of faith, that I'm going to take this step of obedience. I believe that you've called me to live in transparency, and so I'm going to go, and I'm going to go to group. I'm going to go find an accountability partner. I'm going to confess it. And so, God, I am going to believe that that's true. And I believe that you have called me to generosity. I believe that you have called me to a life of being on mission, of loving and serving and preaching the gospel. But God, how do I know that you're going to show up? How do I know that you're going to be there? How do I, like when the turbulence of life gets wild, how do I know? Because I believe you. But sometimes believing in an intangible God, sometimes just believing, it's just, how do I know? And he said to him, and I love this, because he says to him, bring me a heifer, 3 years old, a female goat, 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Now, if you aren't deep in Bible, that's the weirdest response that God has ever given. Think about this. God, how do I know? Y'all see a farm anywhere? Which we would say, well, what are you talking about? Number one, notice this, that he doesn't say, whoa, 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 whoa. I thought you believed me. Get away from me, you evildoer, you harborer of evil and doubt and hatred. No. He says, okay, you want to know? Come here. And this is what we said each week, is that when we talk about the idea of faith, many of us have bought into the idea of faith, that faith is this leap into the abyss of the unknown, of which God's just saying, turn off your critical thought, turn off your judgment, turn off your reason, and just believe. Well, what he's actually saying, and consistently through Scripture, says, hey, follow me. Before I ask you to believe in me, I'm going to ask you to follow me. Because when you experience me, when you experience my teachings, when you experience what I have to say, when you experience my presence, I'm telling you, you're going to believe. He did not reject him, but he substantiated it. And he says, okay, bring to me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And the wild thing is Abram knew exactly what to do this, and he brought him all these, verse 10, cut them in half, laid each half against each other, but he did not cut the birds in half. And when the birds of prey came down on the carcass, Abram drove them away. Now, again, what in the world are we doing here? So, let me give you a little Bible lesson. In our culture, when we agree to something, two parties agree to something, we sign a contract, often the covenant. And this contract, if you think about the context of what a contract actually is, contracts don't exist for when things go well. No one's like, man, here's the point of our contract, is I'm going to assume that you're going to do everything that you do, and I'm just going to say, here's the cool things about this. No, it's, here's what happens if you don't. Here's what happens if you don't. Here's what happens if you are late, if this thing doesn't work through, or if you don't hold up your end of the obligation and responsibility. Well, they lived in an oral culture, not a written culture. And so when two people today get married, Dylan and Allie got married a couple weeks back. Afterwards, at the reception, sign the wedding license, right? And in signing that, it's interesting, because that's actually the part that creates legal obligation. If they decided at some point that they were not going to be married anymore, which I don't even like to say out loud, but let's just say something crazy happened, that signing of that contract creates obligations if they fail to fulfill their obligations to that contract. Well, in the same way, they would create a contract, and it was called a covenant. But what's interesting is, and I actually think this would probably be better for us, it would be gruesome and we shouldn't do it, but I think this would be better for us, is instead of signing and writing, they acted out the consequence if they were unfaithful to that covenant. And so when God said, okay, here's the animals that I want you to bring, what Abram knew is this: I'm about to sign a contract with God. Now that is wild, to think that God would say, okay, I am making a promise to you of which I am now becoming contractually obligated. And Abram just says, okay, I'll get them. I'll cut them. And the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram. And behold, a dreadful darkness fell on him. Then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in the land that is not theirs, and will be servants there. And they will be afflicted for 400 years. This is interesting. He says, okay, here's what I want you to know. It sounds great. But know that your offspring, they're going to be wanderers. They're not going to have a permanent home for a little while. And I also want you to know that as they do that, they're going to be in a foreign land, they're going to be servants there. Well, that doesn't sound like a wonderful promise. He says, I'm not done. They will be afflicted 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possession. And for you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in old age. And they shall come back here in the fourth generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Now this is one more thing. I just want to point out, it's a fascinating thing that I think we could just kind of see ourselves in. Is every promise God makes to Abraham, but none of the promises that God makes to Abraham, God promises for Abraham to see in his lifetime. Think about that. Here's the promise. That's amazing. You're going to make my name great through what you're going to do in me, through me. You're going to bless all the nations of the world. Yes. But you're not going to see it. You're going to have one son, and they're going to give birth to more kids, and those more kids are eventually going to spend 400 years, enslaved. But eventually it's going to happen. Well, so how does he obligate himself to this? In verse 17, when the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. Now this is, again, heavy into Bible imagery. But if you've read, farther into the Old Testament, here's what you've seen. Is that God's presence, as the people of the nation of Israel was delivered from Egyptian slavery, the presence of God, they were led through the wilderness by a pillar of smoke and a pillar of fire, kind of a pillar of smoke, a cloud of smoke by day and a pillar of fire by night. And so those same words that he uses, he says, okay, so those same ideas, these same things that a smoking pot of fire, and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. This was, and let me just kind of break this down, this was the symbolism, this was the manifestation of the presence of God. And this would happen multiple times throughout the Old Testament. That this was the presence of God. And here's what the covenant says. I'm going to pass through this. And if either of us are unfaithful to this covenant, let what happened to these animals happen to me. You flip over, or you can just write this down. Jeremiah 34:18. This is a prophecy from God to Jeremiah. And the men who transgressed my covenant did not keep the terms of the covenant that they made before me. I will make them like the calf that they cut in two and pass between its parts. So this was the idea, right? Is that instead of just saying, yeah, if we don't do it, here's what's going to happen. They said, if we don't do it, we're going to act out what's going to happen. And as he walks through, God walks through, in essence, in part to say, hey, if I, God, am unfaithful to the contract that's happening here, I want you to know that I'll die. If I, God, am unfaithful to this, let the immutable become mutable, let the intangible become tangible, let the eternal become temporal. And in that, let what happened as these bodies are shredded and torn apart, let that happen to me. And so I want you to know that you can trust me because I am making a covenant to you, which must have been wild for Abram because at the time, he's just sitting there thinking, like, okay, God, I just asked for a promise. And God said, I'm going to make a promise enough to where if I'm not true to my promise, if I don't keep my promise, then I want you to know I'll die. Which is great. But if we're being honest, and this is what I find interesting, is the longer you've been a Christian, the way that you think about the promise of God shifts. And here's what I mean by that. When you first become a Christian, when you're thinking about Jesus, here's kind of the question. Is he enough? Is he enough? Like, is he actually enough to keep me? Is he actually enough to sustain me? Is he actually enough to give me life and give me life abundantly? And is he actually enough to carry me into the next life? Is he enough? And many of you, this is our experience. The longer I've been a Christian, the question is, am I enough? Is he really going to continue to put up with me? I mean, I promised him I'm going to stop doing this 50 times. And now we're on 51, and now we're on 62, and now we're on 74. And I just feel like, God, at some point you're tired of me. At some point you cast me out. At some point you've pushed me away. So it's not necessarily, God, I really never questioned whether you were a good God who held up to his end of the covenant. I questioned myself. Am I good enough? And this is where everything flips. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. And on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Canaanites, the Kenizzites, the Kadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites, which we would say neat. But here's what's fascinating. Every scholar who studies this, they observe one thing. In their day, it was very common. It was very common for a king or some type of an overlord and the servant to enter into a contract together. It was also common for a servant to pass through this covenant, saying, if anything that I'm unfaithful to, let this happen to me. But the king was kind of too good. The king was kind of too great. The king wasn't willing to say, if I'm unfaithful, then I'll pass through this too. It's no, if I'm unfaithful, and I just made a different decision because I'm the king, I can do what I want. And what every scholar who reads this looks and says is that the most stunning thing of this passage is that God singularly walks through this. Here's why I say that. Many of us, we just think Jesus just kind of happened. And if Jesus just kind of happened, then that means God is very reactive and God is not intentional. If God is very reactive and God is not intentional, then that means we actually can't trust God in this world with what he says. Because if he's just up in heaven as some God in the sky simply reacting to what's going on, then what we know is we don't really trust him with our lives. And that as a preventative, we trust him to react accordingly or respond accordingly to the circumstances of our life. But the reality is we don't actually trust God. We just hope that he's going to make something out of the mess. And here's what God says. I am not responding. I did not just show up. This has been the plan the entire time. Genesis 3, I'm going to pronounce for the curse. Genesis 4, I'm going to give you a demonstration that there's going to be this Abel who killed this lamb, who was counted righteousness and was killed for it at the hands of the religiously jealous. And that's going to be foreshadowing to what's going to happen with Jesus. In Genesis 15, I am going to make this covenant with you, Abram, and it is going to be a sign, a foreshadowing, pointing that I am an intentional God and you can trust me. Because here's what that means. Abram, I am unilaterally and singularly taking the consequence of the covenant on my shoulders. In other words, Genesis 15, Abram, if you're unfaithful, then let the immutable become mutable. Let the impossible become possible. Let the infinite become finite. Let this sense that I pay this penance, I pay this thing, this fine from this contract, because when I do, it puts us at a better state because you have now paid the consequence of which your actions have created. And what he declares way back in Genesis 15 is Jesus was not a mistake. The Messiah was not by happenstance. That here's what I want you to know. If you are unfaithful to this covenantal contract, it is not contingent on you, it is contingent on me, and if you are unfaithful, I will die. Which is why Isaiah says it was the will of God to crush him. Which is why John said, the Lamb of God to take away the sin of the world. Which is why Jesus, before he died, said, this is my body, this is my blood. When he did communion, this is establishing the new covenant. The covenant that Abraham was pointing to is actually being fulfilled through me. And if you wonder if it was by happenstance, then don't think I'm not answering the question in the class because I'm God and I'm not just around. And if you can't see it in your lifetime, I understand that's tough. But the reason that he introduces us to the people of faith is to say that there are women and men, people of faith, who have gone before us, who trusted in God. And at the end of Hebrews, he says, and they didn't even have what we have because we live in the wake of the cross. Here's what I want you to know. You have a God who in Genesis 15 called his shot and said, if either of us are unfaithful to this covenant, let me die. In Matthew, in Mark, in Luke, in John, all document the day God died. The day the immutable became mutable. The eternal became temporal. The intangible became tangible. And here's why. To pay the consequence, the fine that we should have paid. Not because he hates us, but because he loves us. Here's why I say that. Faith is not simply an awareness of the existence of God. Faith is not simply this idea of I just agree with a level of truth claims. Faith is, God, I trust you. I trust you. And here's what I want you to see. That we don't do that blindly. We do that to a God who said at the beginning of this entire thing, I am going to show you that I am a God worth trusting. When it doesn't seem like, when it seems like I haven't answered your question, when it seems like I've kind of pushed you away, I want you to know. When it feels like you have gone too far, when it feels like you've done too much, when it feels like, God, I have promised you 85 times that I'm not going to go on the internet and look at that again. When I promise you, God, 85 times I'm going to live in such a way that I'm going to be a light, I'm going to love and I'm going to serve people. And I went out today, I was just completely selfish. God, I promise you 85 times that I'm not going to get angry with my kids or I'm not going to get angry with my spouse, and then I do it again. And God, I promise you and I promise you and I promise you over and over. And I wonder, have I outrun the love of God in my life? Which is when Paul would come back and say that there is nothing that can separate us from the love of God. You want to know why? Because the love of God was not contingent on our ability to execute the contract. It was unilaterally contingent on Him. In Genesis, He displayed the consequence but in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, He lived the consequence. That we now trust Him because He's trustworthy. Not just because He died, and not just because He rose again, but because we see a faithful God working through women and men of faith whose faith is not perfect, but whose faith is resilient, because their faith was not contingent. Their relationship was not contingent on them. We serve a God who so loved us. In our rebellion, He sent His Son to die for us. Here's my hope. I don't know where this hits you. I don't know where this strikes you. But I want you to know that you have a God who so loves you. He sent His Son to die, but He also sent Abram and created a covenant to say, I don't want you to miss it. And I'm going to layer it over and over and over and over and over and over again, because when my Son comes, I want the entire world to know this is for them. This is for anybody. This is for everybody. This is the blessing that through Him all nations will be blessed, no matter your background, no matter your morality, no matter what you've done, no matter who you've been, no matter where you are. This is, I will take the curse of your rebellion on my shoulders. And on the cross, He took the sin of the entire world so that we would no longer live for ourselves, but live for Him who died for us, that we would place our entire lives and say, God, I trust you. I trust you. When life hurts, I trust you. When things are difficult, I trust you. When it doesn't make sense to me, I trust you. Even if I'm not going to see the fulfillment of what I feel like you've called me to, I trust you. Because you're a God who has continually proven Himself trustworthy. And God, if there was a reason for you to not be trustworthy, it's not because you're not. It's because I'm not. And you took care of that too. So I trust you. I don't know what step of faith God is calling you to, but if He's called you to it, God is a God who always fulfills His promises, because the fulfillment is contingent on Him, not us. Let's pray. God, I ask that you would help each and every one of us to trust you more. As we see what you've done, as we see how you've died, as we see how in Genesis you displayed the consequence of not keeping the covenant. And yet in the New Testament, you fulfilled the consequence of our not keeping the new covenant. You, God, died for us. And so we just trust you. We don't deserve it. We didn't earn it, but you did it. And God, we are so thankful. And so I pray just for whatever's happened in the hearts of each person, that we would know that, God, you're a God who, you were intentional when we didn't realize it. You had a thought when we weren't even thinking. And you had a plan long before we showed up. In fact, you had a plan long before your son Jesus stepped foot on this planet. And it was a plan for redemption. It was a plan for salvation. It was a plan for the covenant and the relationship to be restored by you. And so, God, whatever the thing is, we just trust you. We trust you. Help us to live as people who don't just believe in you, but God, we believe you. Give us the wisdom to know what that kind of faith looks like and the courage to trust. And it's in your name we pray.